If you ask most people with global business or other concerns, what will be the greatest phenomenon of the 21st century, 70 to 80% of them would say the impact of the rising economies of China and India. So today, as we begin the Asian New Year, this year of the rat, we have called upon the author of The Elephant and the Dragon, The Rise of India and China and What It Means for All of Us. RobynMeredith is Senior Editor Asia for Forbes magazine. Her journalistic credentials are extensive. She's a writer of great clarity of words and thought, and yes, you have also seen her on TV giving expert opinion. She lives in Hong Kong and so brings us firsthand knowledge and insight on topic today. She just flew in last night, and since she is missing the full expression of festivities of Chinese New Year by coming to us, let's welcome her now with some of the warm energy of Houston, Texas. Here's RobynMeredith.
Well, thank you so much. And I wanted to bring a special message from Hong Kong to all of you here, which is Kung Hei Fat Choi. And that's Happy Chinese New Year. That's today. So I'm glad that I can celebrate with you halfway around the world. Today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about India and China. And what I want you to remember is this. We must understand what's going on in India and China, or we risk being left behind. Has anyone in the audience been to China? Quite a few. How about India? All right, also quite a lot. Great. Well, I wrote a book called The Elephant and the Dragon, and it's the story of how India and China are changing their destinies and how that's changing the destiny of the world. To me, India is like an elephant. It's trudging along slowly but steadily into the future. China's like a dragon. It's fast, it's furious, but it kind of scares us. And dragons are imaginary. India's taking this slow and steady approach to returning to the globalized economy, and that really contrasts with China's rocket-like rise. I've covered both countries in my book, but in so many ways, even though we're lumping them together here today, they are really, really opposites. India's democratic, China's authoritarian. India's capitalist, but often anti-business, whereas China's communist, but frequently pro-business. Look at the politics. In China in October, the Communist Party leadership held their most important political gathering in years. You know what they were deciding? They were deciding who would be the next president. Not now, but 5 years from now, who would succeed Hu Jintao. Now, I happened to be in India at the very time that China was having that meeting, and I was so struck by the difference because when I was in Delhi and in Beijing, they're choosing the next leader for 5 years from now, the Indian government almost fell that very week. So in India, you don't know who's going to be in power in 5 days or 5 weeks, whereas in China, they know who's going to be in power 5 years from now. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what these places look like for the benefit of those who haven't been there. They're just completely different. When you go to India, you see this riot of bright colors. It's a cacophonous nation. There are 30 different languages, including English. Its airports and its roads are unbelievably shabby. The time zone mystifies outsiders. It's a half hour off from every place else in the world. So at 9 in the morning in Houston, it's 8:30 at night in Bombay. Crazy. Compared with China, India looks completely chaotic. But when outsiders see the chaos, they often miss that India has unseen strengths. India has this invisible human infrastructure that is really the nation's mighty resource as it reconnects to the global economy. By contrast, China is straightforward. The national language is Mandarin. Clocks line up with the rest of the world, and no doubt about it, the Communist Party runs the country. China looks strong on the outside. It has brand new airports that, frankly, are a lot better than most in the United States. It has highways that are a marvel. It's a huge contrast to India's shoddy infrastructure. But China's not as strong as it appears. We can sometimes forget how recent the Cultural Revolution was. And during that time, China closed its colleges. And during that time that China's colleges were closed, India was nurturing a whole generation of engineers and doctors and scholars and scientists. And while China was practicing communism and persecuting capitalists, Indian managers gained experience by battling it out in a really tough local market. And the result is that today, by and large, Indian businesses are much better run than Chinese businesses. India and China are opposites in so many ways, but they do have one really important characteristic in common. And that is that the transformations underway in both those countries are just powerfully changing the world for all of us. One of the many people I interviewed for my book is the former Treasury Secretary, Robert Rubin. And he says the rise of India and China is the greatest challenge since the emergence of the United States more than 100 years ago. I call it tectonic economics. And what I mean by that is right before our eyes, you have this geopolitical and economic shift of just seismic proportions. The newfound strength of India and China is dramatically altering geopolitics. The economic successes of India and China are straining an environment that has already been stretched thin by developed countries like the United States. And the increased demand for natural resources, from oil to copper to most recently food, has led to higher prices around the world recently, even as it has produced lower prices for consumer goods in the United States. I want to spend some time, though, on one aspect of the changes that we often don't step back and think about, but that is very, very crucial, and that is this. We did not used to have a global job market. Now we do. This new global job market is worrying Americans, and it should. Because with both India and China open for business, about 1 billion new working-age people were just added to the global labor pool, and it just so happens that almost all of them earn dramatically less than all of us. The chairman of Intel, Craig Barrett, is another person I talked to for the book, and he said, I don't think most people appreciate the magnitude of the change coming our way. He said, this is a tsunami coming our way. Over the next 10 years, you're going to see major, major dislocation, he said. Now, he's not just talking about blue-collar jobs moving to China. He's talking about white-collar jobs moving to both China and India. Let me give you an example of the potential shakeup. As you know, India and China each have more than 1 billion people, and they have increasing numbers of college graduates. So in India, 2.7 million kids graduate from university each year. China now graduates 5 million, up from, remember, 0 during the Cultural Revolution. And that means that each of these Asian giants is producing more college graduates in their workforces each year than the US and Europe combined. And because technology connects that well-educated workforce in Asia to us here in the West, Americans can no longer expect to earn 10 times more than everyone else for the same work. That's sobering. Multinational companies are taking advantage of these new labor market developments. IBM, GE, Microsoft have each hired tens of thousands of Indians in recent years. Accenture, they had 800 Indian employees 5 years ago. Today, they have 35,000 employees in India, and that's more than they have in the United States. The three biggest Indian outsourcing companies have a combined 260,000 workers, and most are doing work in India on behalf of Western companies, and most of them were hired just in the last decade. So while Chinese and Indian companies literally are worrying about how to recruit fast enough, Westerners are worrying about layoffs. The whole world is being forced to adjust to this new workplace reality. And by the way, for global business executives today, an understanding of India and China is considered as basic as essential as a basic grasp of accounting used to be. Why? Because India and China are growing about 3 times as fast as established economies like the United States and Europe. So multinational companies that want to please their shareholders are counting on fast growth from India and China. And fast growth is exactly what's happened. You know, I feel really fortunate because I've been able to explore India and China. And I want to just take you on a little journey to both places without leaving this room. Let's go to China first. During the research for my book, I visited a Chinese toy factory in southern China, and I tell you, you never know where you're going to find Jesus. I discovered him in a toy factory in southern China, standing on a shelf of talking toys. Now, this was a Barbie doll-sized Jesus. And he was standing there right next to Mickey Mouse, Barney, and Winnie the Pooh. But my serious point about this rather non-denominational toy factory that I visited was that there are 2,000 workers in that toy factory, and they turn out millions of toys each year, most of them headed to the United States. When the factory was built 12 years ago, it was surrounded by fields. And today, all the farmland for an hour's drive in any direction has turned into factories. Meanwhile, the Chinese province where they make the Jesus and the Winnie the Pooh dolls has become the center of the global toy industry. It has 5,000 factories, other toy factories, all of them newly built, giving millions of Chinese peasants jobs that simply didn't exist a decade ago, and giving millions of Americans lower prices. China's metamorphosis from farmland to factories was fast. In the year 2000, 30% of the world's toys came from China. That's a lot. But 5 years later, 75%, 3 out of every 4 new toys in the world was made in China. And I'm talking about toys, but as it goes for toys, so it goes for shoes and auto parts and electronic components and all kinds of other products. Isn't that alarming? All along China's coast, fields have turned into factories exporting goods to the West. But as I mentioned earlier, China is not as strong as it looks, because the majority of those toys and shoes and auto parts and computers are made by foreign companies or on behalf of foreign companies, and they just happen to be made in China. So for now, China's economic muscle largely belongs to foreigners. So a lot of those cheap goods that we're buying from China are actually made by America in China, or made by Japan in China, or made by Korea in China, or made by European companies in China, and then they're exported here to the United States. But nonetheless, the transformation from a nation of farms to a nation of factories is astonishing. China now exports more in a single day than in the entire year of 1978, which is when China began its economic transformation and its return to capitalism. So China's just gone through an industrial revolution right before our eyes. And that's given millions of Chinese peasants jobs that didn't exist a decade ago. It's given millions of us lower prices. It's returned China to a global economic power, and it's reshaped the lives of workers, not just in China, but around the world. And that's tectonic economics. Now let's go to India. Remember I told you it doesn't look anything like China? Well, if you visit the Bangalore headquarters of a place like Infosys, one of the big Indian tech companies, you'll drive there on potholed, gridlocked streets. You'll see barefoot children walking to school. You'll see women in bright saris that are carrying really heavy loads on their heads. You'll see the occasional cow, sacred cow, grazing by the side of the road. But when you're inside the guarded gates of a company like Infosys, you see what looks just like an American college campus. Inside those gates, you see the newly emerging India as well as the entire global economy on the move. Because almost all of the young workers at a place like Infosys are doing work on behalf of American or European companies. In the same way that those Chinese toy factory workers are making goods that are bought by those of us here. And back when the Infosys campus was built 13 years ago, most workers rode buses or motorcycles to work. Now, just a decade later, they are yuppies who fill up a whole parking deck with their cars. Their children are not barefoot. They go to private school. And those 20 and 30-something workers, the young tech workers of India, are completely different from their parents. Their parents couldn't afford homes and cars, usually, until they were in their 40s and 50s. That's the Indian middle class of a generation ago. And these young tech workers can not only afford those, cars and homes, they're buying them for their parents. So for the young and educated, India has been transformed to a land of prosperity and opportunity. There's something like the American dream has just been created in India. There are now possibilities that simply didn't exist there before, and it's really wonderful to see. Again, that's tectonic economics. As you can see, there are tremendous opportunities for business and workers around the world as the result of the rise of India and China. And that's particularly true because of the technology that's connecting those workforces in the East to the companies and consumers in the West. I also want to point out one thing. We've been talking a little bit about the dangers and the huge changes that are taking place. But we're also there's something very, very good happening now. It's very important. Now that India and China have chosen to change their destinies and reconnect with the world, hundreds of millions of Indians and Chinese have been lifted out of abject poverty, out of dollar-a-day poverty levels. And think about that. That's an enormous achievement. We've been trying with aid programs for decades to help get people out of poverty. And the embrace of globalization and capitalism by these two enormous countries has done more good for those poor people in those countries than most everything else we've tried. I mention that because sometimes people become afraid of the rise of India and China. And I just want to point to that good that's happening for the world. I think it's something we don't want to try to stop. I do want to talk a little bit about how America should respond, though. You see, I'm a little bit worried because when I come to the United States, I live in Hong Kong, but when I come to the United States, I see most people, first of all, not really understanding the enormity of the changes underfoot, but also not taking any action as a result of them. And in so many areas today, business, job markets, geopolitics, the environment, the world is facing really big changes because of the rise of India and China. So what does it mean for Americans? Are India and China our friends or our foes? Is the rise of India and China good for America or bad? What it boils down to, of course, is that India and China are both friends and foes. Frenemies, if you will. So some individual Americans are feeling the squeeze in the job market from India and China. But collectively, Americans are benefiting from the increased trade and faster economic growth around the world. Now that we understand what's happening, though, we must adjust because the changes there are inevitable. And to meet those historic challenges, the United States cannot afford complacency. So what should we do? Should we turn to protectionism? Should we just let the free market ride? I don't think so. I think the nation has to choose a third way. The Elephant and the Dragon talks about this in much greater detail, but let me just summarize the two most important things America needs to do to thrive despite the new competition from overseas, to turn a threat into an opportunity. First, we must recognize that job losses are inevitable. We're entering an era of increasing job turnover, and both governments and companies should weave a stronger safety net, one with better job loss insurance schemes and better programs for retraining workers who inevitably will be displaced. At the same time, governments at the local, state, federal level need to focus on promoting policies that encourage job creation. Americans and others from developed countries need to work on improving our competitiveness in this newly global economy in the short term and the long term. We must redouble our efforts on education. You know as well as I that our schools are not good enough today. We face a big challenge, but we shouldn't give up. The United States does not have 1 billion people, but when it comes to competing in the world economy, even a global economy in the midst of an historic shakeup, America has enormous advantages and resources. The U.S. has the world's largest economy. We have the best trained workforce. U.S. companies own most of the world's cutting-edge technology. But most important is this: Americans have a history, a track record of remarkable innovation and creativity and flexibility. These are the cultural traits that helped America send a man to the moon when President Kennedy called upon our nation to concentrate our efforts. We should let the rise of India and China be a catalyst to reestablish America's competitiveness. Because you know what? If India and China can so dramatically transform themselves and face the world, so can the United States of America. Thank you very much.
All right, any questions that you might have, hold on to them, jot them down. You'll have a chance to talk face-to-face with Robyn when we break out in a little bit.